The year was 1878, and the dust of West Texas had settled into the very marrow of Abigail Donovan's bones. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated her skin, lined the creases of her hands, and flavored every breath she drew. It was the same dust that had buried her hopes one by one, until they were just forgotten lumps beneath the scorched earth. Her life, once a small, hopeful seed carried from the green hills of Pennsylvania, had withered in this unforgiving landscape, choked by the twin blights of isolation and her husband, Walter. Walter Donovan was a man hollowed out by whiskey and disappointment. He had promised her a kingdom on the plains, a sprawling ranch teeming with cattle and life. What he had delivered was a ramshackle cabin leaning against the wind like a tired old man, a handful of bone-thin cows, and a silence so profound it screamed. The silence was broken only by the howl of the wind or the slurred, bitter litany of his failures, which he laid at her feet like dead things. Her days were a cycle of grueling, thankless labor, a litany of chores that began before the sun bruised the horizon and ended long after it had bled away. She mended fences Walter broke in drunken stumbles, tended a garden that fought a losing war with the heat, and turned his meager earnings from trapping into bland, sustaining meals he rarely thanked her for. She moved through this routine with a hardened resignation, her spirit encased in a callus as thick as the ones on her palms. She had once been a woman who laughed easily, whose heart was a vessel for dreams. Now it was a locked chest, and she had long ago misplaced the key. The grief she carried was not for Walter. Affection for him had evaporated years ago, leaving behind only a residue of pity and fear. She grieved for the girl she had been, the one who had believed in promises. She grieved for the children she would never have, the laughter that would never echo against the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Her existence had become a state of suspended animation, a long, quiet wait for an end she could not imagine. It was on a blistering afternoon, when the sun beat down with the fury of a blacksmith's hammer, that the end she could not imagine arrived. It came in the form of 5 Comanche riders, materializing from the heat haze like spirits of the plains. They sat upon their horses with an unnerving stillness, their dark eyes taking in the pathetic scene of the Donovan homestead. The broken corral, the dust, choked well, Walter slumped on the porch steps, a near-empty bottle dangling from his hand. Abigail watched from the shadows of the cabin doorway, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She had heard stories, terrifying tales whispered in the nearest settlement, a place she hadn't seen in over a year. But these men were not the frenzied demons of those stories. They were quiet, lean, and possessed a dignity that made Walter's slumped form seem all the more wretched. Their leader sat slightly forward, his presence commanding without a single word. He was a man who seemed carved from the very rock and sun of the land itself. His face was a mask of stern concentration, his gaze missing nothing. He looked from the failing ranch to Walter, and then his eyes found hers in the doorway. For a moment, she felt pinned by that look, seen in a way that was both terrifying and utterly absolute. Walter staggered to his feet, trying to muster some semblance of authority. "What do you want?" he slurred, his voice a pathetic rasp. The leader, Chayton, did not answer him directly. He spoke a few low words in his own tongue to the man beside him. His gaze remained fixed on Walter, cold and assessing. He was not looking at a threat, he was looking at an object of contempt. He had seen men like this before, white men who drowned their weakness in sour drink and let their world crumble around them. Walter, emboldened by the whiskey, puffed out his chest. "Get off my land." Chayton dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He walked not to Walter, but to the single, sad-looking horse, tied to the porch railer scrawny nag, with a swayed back and a coat the color of mud. He ran a hand over its flank, his expression unreadable. Then he looked back at Walter, and then again at Abigail. A silent, chilling calculus was taking place in the space between them. He pointed a single finger, first at the horse, then at Abigail. A sick, Cold dread washed over her, so potent it nearly buckled her knees. She understood. It was not a raid, it was not a random act of violence, it was a transaction. Walter blinked, his liquor-fogged brain struggling to catch up. He followed the Comanche's gesture, his eyes moving from the nag to his wife. A grotesque smile, a twisted parody of cunning, spread across his face. He saw not betrayal, not the ultimate act of cruelty, but an opportunity. A way to get something, anything, for a life he had already discarded. Her? Walter grunted, a dry, ugly chuckle escaping his throat. For the horse? Chayton gave a single, sharp nod. Abigail wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but her limbs were made of lead, and her throat was choked with dust and horror. She was frozen, a spectator at the auction of her own life. Walter sealed the deal with a wave of his hand, a grand, dismissive gesture that signed away 18 years of marriage and a woman's soul. "She's yours," he said. Two of the other warriors dismounted. They moved toward the cabin, their steps measured and unhurried. Abigail finally found her voice, a small, desperate sound. "Walter, no, please." He wouldn't look at her. He was already walking toward the horse, his prize, his face alight with a pathetic, momentary triumph. He had won a trade. The warriors took her arms. Their grip was not brutal, but it was inescapable, as firm and unyielding as granite. They pulled her from the doorway, out into the merciless glare of the sun. She stumbled, her worn boots kicking up puffs of the dust that had defined her existence. She cast one last, desperate look back at the man who had been her husband. He was untying the horse, his back turned to her, already absorbed in his new possession. He did not look back. He never looked back. She was placed on the back of one of the warrior's horses, seated in front of him like a sack of grain. Chayton swung himself onto his own mount, his face impassive. With a low command, they turned and rode away, leaving the leaning cabin and the drunken man and the single worthless horse behind. The life of Abigail Donovan was over. Whatever came next was something nameless, something born of dust and betrayal, under the silent, watchful eyes of a Comanche chief. The journey was a blur of misery. The sun was a relentless tormentor, and the rhythmic sway of the horse was a constant reminder of her captive state. The warrior she rode with ignored her completely. She was cargo, nothing more. The land stretched on, an endless, khaki-colored canvas of rock and scrub brush, indifferent to her terror. They rode for what felt like days, though she quickly lost track of time. The world was reduced to the heat on her skin, the ache in her bones, and the gnawing fear in her belly. She expected cruelty. The stories had been full of it, but what she received was a profound and unsettling indifference. When they stopped to rest, she was given a small portion of dried meat and a sip of water from a skin, just enough to keep her alive. The men spoke in low tones she couldn't understand, their faces giving away nothing. They treated her not as a person, but as a piece of property that needed to be delivered intact. It was a dehumanization more chilling than any overt act of violence. Only Chayton seemed to register her as a living, breathing thing. She would feel his eyes on her from across the small, flickering campfires at night. It was not a lecherous gaze, nor was it kind. It was observational, analytical, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. He watched how she ate the tough jerky, how she huddled in the thin blanket she'd been given when the desert night grew cold, how her eyes darted nervously at every sound. He saw the terror, but he also seemed to see the flicker of resilience beneath it, the stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished. Once, when she fumbled with the water skin, spilling a precious few drops, he walked over, took it from her, and held it to her lips himself, ensuring she drank properly. The gesture was devoid of gentleness, a purely practical act, yet it was the first hint of direct attention she had received, and it confused her more than any threat could have. The Comanche camp, when they finally reached it, was nestled in a hidden canyon, a collection of hide lodges that blended into the landscape. Smoke curled lazily into the sky, and the sounds of life dogs barking, children laughing, women talking rushed at her, overwhelming her senses. She was pulled from the horse and set on her feet, her legs trembling from exhaustion. And then the staring began. Every eye in the camp was on her. The women's faces were hard, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and undisguised contempt. She was the other, the intruder, a white woman brought into their world like a strange and unwelcome animal. The children were bolder, creeping closer to touch the pale fabric of her dress before scurrying away with giggles. She stood alone in the center of it all, a pillar of shame and fear, wishing the earth would open up and swallow her whole. Chaitan spoke to the camp, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmurs. He gestured toward her, then toward a small, isolated lodge at the edge of the settlement. An older woman with a face like a weathered map and eyes that held no warmth came forward. Chaitan spoke to her, then turned and walked away toward his own, larger lodge in the center of the camp, leaving Abigail in the woman's charge. Abigail had expected to be thrown into a lodge with other captives, to be put to work as a common slave, to be claimed and used. Instead, she was led to the empty lodge and simply left there. A pile of furs lay in the corner, a clay pot of water and a strip of cooked meat set beside it. Then the flap of the lodge was closed, plunging her into semi-darkness and a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise outside. She was not a slave, not a wife, not a captive in the way she understood it. She was simply there. A strange object placed on a shelf, its purpose yet to be determined by the man who had bought her for a horse. The days that followed were a crucible of loneliness. The old woman, whose name she learned was Wachiwi, would appear at the flap of her lodge each morning. She would not speak, but would gesture for Abigail to follow. Wachiwi was her teacher in a school of survival where the lessons were silent and the punishments for failure were shame and hunger. Abigail learned to scrape hides, her soft hands quickly blistering and then hardening into tools. She learned to grind corn with a stone, the rhythmic work, a strange, monotonous comfort. She learned to haul water from the spring that trickled from the canyon wall. Her efforts were met with a stoic silence from Wachiwi and scornful glances from the other women. They saw her clumsiness, her ignorance of their ways. They muttered in their own language, and though she could not understand the words, the tone of derision was universal. She was an outsider, a ghost in their midst, and they made sure she felt it. She ate her meager meals alone in her lodge, the sounds of family and community from the surrounding camp, serving only to deepen her profound isolation. Yet she did not break. The same stubborn resilience that had seen her through the years with Walter now served her in this new, alien world. She worked without complaint, her hands growing stronger, her body leaner and harder. She watched everything, listened to the cadence of the language, learned the names of tools and tasks through observation. She learned that respect in this place was not given, it was earned through quiet competence and endurance, and so she endured. Chaitan remained a distant, powerful presence. He never approached her directly, but she felt his gaze on her often. He watched her from the entrance of his lodge as she learned to mend a torn moccasin under Wachiwi's critical eye. He watched as she carried buckets of water that slopped and soaked the front of her dress, her face set with determination. He saw that she did not weep, did not beg, did not collapse. He saw the strength she kept hidden, the iron in her spine. He had not bought a weak, simpering creature. He had bought a survivor. The shift began subtly, a change in the emotional weather so slight it was almost imperceptible. It started with a child, a little boy who was seized by a coughing fever that left him weak and gasping for breath. The medicine man performed his chants, but the boy's condition only worsened. His mother's cries were a thin, sharp sound of grief that cut through the daily rhythms of the camp. Abigail, listening from her lodge, felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a useless, aching sympathy. Back in Pennsylvania, her mother had been a woman skilled in the use of herbs and folk remedies. She had taught Abigail which plants could soothe a cough, which leaves could break a fever. Hesitantly, she remembered the willow bark tea for fever and the mullein leaf for lungs choked with phlegm. She had seen both plants growing near the spring. For a full day, she wrestled with herself. To interfere would be an unthinkable presumption. It could be seen as a challenge to their medicine man, an insult to their ways. It could earn her a beating, or worse. But the sound of that child's struggle and his mother's weeping wore away at her fear. What more did she have to lose? Taking a deep breath that felt like a leap into a chasm, she left her lodge and walked to the spring. She gathered the leaves and bark, her hands surprisingly sure as she remembered her mother's lessons. Back in her lodge, she crushed the herbs and steeped them in hot water, the familiar, pungent scent, a ghost of a life long past. With the small bowl of tea in her trembling hands, she walked to the sick child's lodge. The mother looked up, her face a mask of suspicion and despair. Abigail knelt, not speaking, and held out the bowl. She looked from the tea to the child, then back to the mother, her eyes pleading for a trust she had not earned. The mother hesitated then. Seeing the desperation in Abigail's expression, she took the bowl. She gently spooned a little of the warm liquid into her son's mouth. Abigail retreated to her lodge, her heart hammering. She had done it. Now she could only wait. She spent the night in a state of terror, expecting an angry warrior to appear at her lodge flap at any moment. But no one came. The next morning, the camp was strangely quiet. When Wachiwi appeared, her face was not set in its usual hard lines. There was something else there, a grudging curiosity. Later that day, Abigail saw the little boy sitting outside his lodge, still weak, but breathing easily. His fever had broken. No one thanked her. No one acknowledged what she had done. But something had changed. The women's stares were no longer entirely hostile. A sliver of respect had entered their gaze. She had offered help not as a white woman, but as a woman, to a mother in pain. She had stepped across the chasm. That evening, as the sun set fire to the canyon walls, Chaitan appeared before her lodge. It was the first time he had come to her directly since her arrival. He did not speak, but held out his hand. In his palm lay a piece of soft, brain-tanned deer hide, creamy and supple. It was a gift, a simple, profound acknowledgement. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection in her desolate world. "Thank you," she whispered, the English words feeling strange and useless. He nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. In their depths, she saw not the cold chief, but a man who understood sacrifice and strength. He gestured for her to follow him. He led her to a spot near his own lodge where a small fire burned. He sat, indicating the ground opposite him. A woman brought them 2 bowls of savory stew, richer and more flavorful than anything Abigail had been given before. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the empty void of loneliness or the tense quiet of mistrust. It was a shared silence, a space where 2 solitary people could simply be, without the need for words. She began to see the man behind the authority. She saw the weariness in his shoulders, the lines of care etched around his eyes. He was a man carrying the weight of his people. He, too, was isolated by his role. He began to speak to her in the evenings that followed, teaching her the Comanche words for Thingstasiwo, sky, Pia, mother, Isa, wolf. He used the few English words he knew, fragments picked up from traders and treaties. Their conversations were patchwork things, built of gestures and single words, but they slowly began to build a bridge between their 2 worlds. Sections, he told her, in his halting way, about his own past. He spoke of a wife lost to the coughing sickness that the white men brought, of a son killed in a skirmish with soldiers. His grief was a vast, silent thing, a landscape inside him as stark and lonely as the plains. In his story, she heard an echo of her own loss, a different song in the same key of sorrow. And he, in turn, began to understand the story. She did not have the words to tell the story of betrayal, of a spirit left to starve, which he could read in the guarded depths of her eyes. The deer hide became a shirt, stitched with a skill she hadn't known she possessed. The other women, led by Wachiwi, began to show her things without scorn, how to bead in intricate patterns, how to find the sweetest roots, which songs were for healing and which for celebration. She was still an outsider, but she was no longer an outcast. She was becoming a part of the weave, a strange new thread in the tapestry of the camp. She had found a tentative place, a fragile beginning of belonging, in the last place on earth she had ever expected to. The fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of men who smelled of greed and cheap whiskey. They were 3 of them, white traders led by a man named Caleb Blackwood, whose eyes were as cold and pale as a winter sky. They rode into the canyon with an arrogant swagger, their pack mules laden with barrels of liquor, cheap trinkets, and rifles. They were the very same breed of parasite that had consumed Walter, men who profited from the slow poisoning of others. They came ostensibly to trade for furs, but their eyes roamed the camp with a predatory hunger. And then Blackwood saw Abigail. She was returning from the spring, her deerskin shirt dark with water where she'd splashed it, her hair braided in the Comanche style Wachiwi had shown her. For a moment he stared, his mind unable to process the sight of a white woman moving with such purpose and belonging in a native camp. His surprise quickly curdled into a possessive kind of avarice. "Well, look what we have here," he said to his men, his voice a low, greasy drawl that made Abigail's skin crawl. "A lost little lamb." Chayton emerged from his lodge, his face a thundercloud. He had dealt with Blackwood's kind before. They were a rot that weakened the people, trading poison for heritage. He stood before the traders, a silent, immovable wall of authority. "You are not welcome here," Chayton said, his English clear and sharp. Blackwood's gaze slid from Abigail to Chayton, a smirk playing on his lips. "We're just here for a little trade, Chief, and maybe to rescue one of our own." He nodded toward Abigail. "That woman, she's with us now." The audacity of the claim hung in the air. Several Comanche warriors moved to stand with their chief, their hands resting near their knives. The women and children melted back toward the lodges, the air crackling with tension. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She was the focal point, the excuse for a conflict that had been brewing since the moment the traders rode in. The fragile sense of belonging she had cultivated felt as if it were about to be torn to shreds. "She is with her people," Chayton stated, his voice dangerously low. He did not look at Abigail, but his words were a shield around her. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Her people? You think she wants to be here? She's a white woman, a Christian woman. You'll give her to us. And for your trouble," he gestured to a barrel on one of his mules, "I'll give you a taste of something that'll make you forget all this unpleasantness." The offer was a profound insult, a suggestion that Chayton's honor and his people could be bought with the very poison he despised. The warriors bristled, their contempt palpable. Some in the camp, however, looked toward the barrel with a flicker of desire in their eyes. The trader's rot had already found cracks in which to seep. "Leave," Chayton commanded, his voice now like the rumble of distant thunder. "Leave now, or you will not leave at all." Blackwood held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. He knew he was outnumbered for now, but his pale eyes locked on Abigail, and in them she saw a chilling promise. He was not giving up. "All right, Chief, have it your way," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "We'll just make our camp downstream, in case you change your mind, or in case the lady does." With that, he and his men turned their mules and rode slowly out of the camp, leaving a trail of unease behind them. The immediate threat had passed, but a more insidious one remained. Abigail was now a source of division. She saw it in the looks of the few who had eyed the whiskey barrel, a renewed suspicion in their gaze. She had brought the white man's trouble to their doorstep. The bond she had so carefully built with this community, and the silent, growing thing between her and Chaitan was about to be put to the ultimate test. The canyon no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a trap, with danger both inside and out. The traders' camp downstream was a festering wound on the land. At night, the sound of their drunken laughter and shouted songs drifted up the canyon, a profane noise that grated on the nerves of the Comanche. The tension in Chaitan's camp was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. The warriors were on edge, patrols circling the perimeter constantly. The trust Abigail had painstakingly earned began to erode under the pressure. The women who had started to share smiles with her now offered only curt nods, their eyes filled with worry. She was the cause, the magnet that had drawn this trouble. Chaitan grew more distant, consumed by the burden of leadership. He spoke little, his face a mask of stone, but Abigail saw the storm in his eyes. He was weighing the safety of his people against the silent promise he had made to her. To give her up would be to appease the traders and remove the immediate threat, but it would be a betrayal of his own honor and the unspoken bond that had grown between them. To protect her risked open conflict, a battle his people, weakened by recent hardships, could not afford. Abigail felt the weight of his dilemma as keenly as her own fear. She spent her nights sleepless in her lodge, listening to the drunken shouts from down the canyon, feeling like a single, loose stone that could trigger an avalanche. She refused to be a passive victim, a prize to be fought over. The woman who had been sold for a horse was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the hard lessons of survival and belonging. This was her home now. These people, for all their renewed suspicion, were her people. She would not be the cause of their destruction. The attack came on the third night, under the sliver of a new moon. The traders, their courage fueled by their own whiskey, crept toward the sleeping camp. They were not warriors. They were clumsy, greedy men, but they were armed with rifles and a brutal sense of entitlement. Their plan was simple: create chaos, grab the woman, and disappear into the darkness. A dog's sharp bark was the first alarm. It was answered by the crack of a rifle, and then the night exploded into chaos. Warriors spilled from their lodges, shadows moving with deadly purpose. The traders fired wildly, their shots echoing through the canyon, sowing panic. Abigail's heart seized with terror, but it was immediately followed by a cold, clear resolve. She would not cower in her lodge. She peeked through the flap and saw the unfolding battle. The Comanche were skilled fighters, but the traders' rifles gave them a dangerous advantage at a distance. She saw a warrior fall, clutching his leg. An idea, born of desperation and knowledge, took root in her mind. The traders had tethered their horses and mules at the narrow entrance to the camp, confident in their attack. Those animals were their only means of escape. Slipping out the back of her lodge, she kept to the deepest shadows, her bare feet making no sound on the cool earth. She moved with a familiarity born of months of walking these paths. She was no longer a stranger here. She knew the contours of the ground, the placement of every rock and bush. She reached the small herd of horses tied loosely to a scrub oak. They were nervous, their eyes wide in the flickering light of the battle. With trembling hands, she pulled the small, sharp knife she used for scraping hides from her belt. It was not a weapon, but it was a tool. She moved quickly from horse to horse, slashing at the tethers. Then, grabbing a fallen branch, she screamed a raw, primal sound of fury and fear and struck the flank of the nearest mule. The effect was instantaneous. The spooked animal bolted, and the others followed, a sudden, thundering stampede of panicked beasts charging back the way they had come, directly toward the traders. The men, caught between the charging animals and the Comanche warriors, were thrown into complete disarray. It was the turning point. The diversion gave the warriors the advantage they needed. But in the chaos, Abigail saw Blackwood, his face contorted with rage, spot her. He had seen what she'd done. Ignoring the fight, he charged toward her, his eyes wild with fury. "You wretched witch," he snarled, lunging for her. She scrambled backward, stumbling over a rock. She fell hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Blackwood was on her in an instant, his hands grabbing the front of her shirt, his face inches from hers, his breath sour with whiskey. "You'll pay for that," he hissed. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. Blackwood was ripped away from her, thrown backward as if by a storm wind. Chayton stood over her, his face a terrible vision of righteous fury. He had seen the attack on her, and something inside him, the carefully controlled discipline of the chief, had finally broken. He did not use a rifle or a bow. He met Blackwood with a raw, focused ferocity, his knife against the traders. The fight was short and brutal. It was not a battle of equals. It was the clash of a man defending his home and his heart against a man driven by pure greed. Chayton moved with the grace of a panther, his movements precise and deadly. He disarmed Blackwood with a swift, jarring blow and drove him to the ground. He held the tip of his blade to the trader's throat, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a fire Abigail had never seen. The other two traders, seeing their leader defeated and their escape cut off, threw down their weapons and surrendered. The battle was over. Chayton did not kill Blackwood. He hauled him to his feet and, with the help of his warriors, bound the three traders. He would not shed their blood in his camp. He would leave them on the plains, without horses or weapons, to face the justice of the land itself. As the chaos subsided, Chayton turned back to Abigail. He walked to where she still sat on the ground, shaken but unhurt. The entire camp was watching now, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. In their eyes, the last traces of suspicion had been replaced by awe and a deep, profound respect. She had not been a liability, she had been a warrior in her own right. She had defended them. Chayton knelt before her, his expression softening as he looked at her. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. It was a gesture of such tenderness, so public and so clear, that a collective sigh seemed to pass through the onlookers. He helped her to her feet, his hand warm and strong in hers. In that moment, before the eyes of all his people, he was not just claiming her, he was honoring her, he was declaring her his. In the quiet aftermath, the canyon seemed to breathe again. The wounded were tended to, the camp was set right, and a new sense of peace, an earned peace, settled over the people. The traders were gone, driven out onto the plains to meet whatever fate awaited them. Their corrupting influence had been purged, and the community felt stronger for it, forged anew in the fire of the confrontation. The way the people looked at Abigail had irrevocably changed. She was no longer Abigail, the white woman, the strange outsider. She was Miha Povi, the name Wachiwi had quietly given her. Morning Flower, the one who had brought help in the dark. The women now included her in their circles without hesitation, sharing stories and laughter. The children flocked to her, no longer shy. She had bled fear for them, and in doing so, had become one of them. That evening, Chayton came to her small lodge. He did not enter, but stood at the threshold, waiting. When she came to him, he led her not to a shared meal by the fire, but to the entrance of his own lodge, the largest in the camp, the heart of the community. Inside, a fire burned warmly, and laid out on a soft buffalo robe was a dress. It was made of the finest, most supple doeskin, adorned with intricate quillwork and shimmering beads in patterns of blue and white, representing the sky and the stars. Beside it lay a necklace of polished bone and turquoise stones, the color of the sacred sky. He did not need to speak the words. The offering was the word itself. This was not a command. It was an invitation. He was asking her to share his fire, his home, his life. He was asking her to be his partner, his equal, the woman who would stand beside the chief. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so profound it was painful. She thought of the life she had left behind, the dusty, loveless existence with a man who had sold her for a broken-down horse. She thought of the terror, the loneliness, the slow, painful journey to this exact moment. It had been a path through hell, but it had led her here, to a place of honor she could never have imagined. She met his gaze, and in his eyes she saw her future. She saw respect. She saw a deep, quiet love, as steady and enduring as the canyon walls around them. She gave him a single, slow nod. A rare, true smile touched Chaitan's lips, transforming his stern face. He took her hand and led her inside. Life found a new rhythm, a harmony of two worlds joined as one. Abigail Donovan became Miha Povi in truth. She learned the language, her tongue slowly mastering the cadence and flow of the Comanche tongue, while she taught Chaitan more of hers. Their conversations were no longer halting but fluid, a private language of shared understanding. She brought her knowledge of healing plants, blending it with the wisdom of the medicine man, who now treated her as a respected peer. She never became a queen in the way the white world understood it, with a golden crown and a throne of jewels. Her crown was the respect of her people. Her throne was the place of honor beside the man she loved. She was the chief's woman, a position of immense influence and responsibility. She advised him, her perspective valued. She mothered the children of the camp, her heart, once a locked and empty chest, now overflowing. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, lying beside Chaitan in their lodge, she would look up through the smoke hole at the vast, star-dusted sky. She would remember the dust and the despair, the absolute certainty that her life was over, and she would feel a sense of wonder so immense it filled her lungs. Her life had ended that day. Her husband sold her. But it had also begun. She had been bought for a single horse, a price of utter contempt. But in the heart of a chief, and in the soul of a people who had tested her and found her worthy, she had discovered her true value, a worth beyond any measure. She had found her home.